Now that we have a semantic range in mind, so we know that the various possibilities of the word destroy, how Paul could be using it. We said it could mean complete annihilation, like eternal damnation. It could mean moral corruption, or it could mean something like destruction, but not in an eternal sense. Maybe like ruin or harm, or destroy, like as in tear down without complete annihilation. The next step that we're taking now is we're going to think out the implications of how those different possibilities would change the meaning of the entire passage. So we've got three options for the word destroy. We're going to plug them in and we're going to see how does it change the entire meaning, so that we know when we weigh the options how this is actually impacting the entire passage. Now, we've got a unique situation here with our study word, in the sense that in the context we're looking at it, it appears twice. So not only are we going to think out the three options for this word and this word, but Paul doesn't have to use them in the same way in one sentence. He could mean one thing by the word destroys here and another thing by the word destroys here. And so we're going to also not just plug in the different words, but also think of combinations. So let's go ahead and start plugging in and thinking out the implications. Well, we said that the word destroy can mean complete annihilation. Now, if that's what Paul means, then the implication here would be that God completely annihilates the person who destroys the temple of God. What could so now we're thinking, what could complete annihilation mean? That's not too far-fetched. God will completely destroy people in the sense of eternal damnation. So that's not too far-fetched. But we do realize the possibility that the people who are destroying the temple of God, if we look in the context, he could be talking about genuinely Christian leaders who are just doing the wrong kinds of things. And so if that's so, that would have an impact possibly on our understanding of eternal salvation, which we want to be as unbiased as possible when we interpret passage. But we do have to take into consideration, if you do believe salvation by salvation, once saved, always saved, then this might have an impact on that. So you just have to keep that in the back of your mind. Anyway, so the implication of complete annihilation would be that God completely annihilates the person who's tearing down the building. Now, leads us to the other question, is what does destroyed mean in the first sense? Now, what would it mean if it meant complete annihilation? Well, in that sense, it would be saying that if any man completely annihilates the temple of God or the body of God or the church, then God will completely annihilate him. Now, the reason we're thinking out all these implications is because now we're going to, later on when we decide to choose how much priority or how much weight we're going to give a certain reading, we're going to take into consideration, is it likely that Paul is worried about somebody completely annihilating the church of God? And so we could, depending on what we believe, we might say that's not very likely that Paul is saying that if any person completely annihilates the temple of God. At this point, we're not making those decisions. We're just thinking it through so that later on when we do decide how likely it is, we have that information. So anyway, we've thought out the implications of what if destroyed means complete annihilation. Now let's think out the implications of what if the word destroy really means moral corruption. If we insert moral corruption in the second half here, then what Paul would be saying is that God will morally corrupt the person who is destroying the temple of God. Moral corruption is, if we took it that way, then we'd be thinking that Paul is saying God will morally corrupt or lead someone into sin. So that's something pretty important to take into consideration when we weigh our options later on. As far as the first half of the verse, Paul would be saying something like, if any man morally corrupts the temple of God or the church of God. And that doesn't seem too far-fetched. People mislead other Christians all the time into sin, and so that doesn't seem too far-fetched. Although, Paul would be, it doesn't take advantage of the context. Again, remember that Paul is in the middle of an illustration where leaders are builders building upon a foundation, and what they're building is the church of God, which is the temple of God. Let's take a look here. See, he says, you are the temple of God. Well, Christian leaders are building upon the foundation of Jesus Christ, building up on it. And Paul is saying that at the end, Jesus Christ will judge them, and their work on the temple will be burned by fire to reveal the quality of the work. And if any man's work remains or survives that trial, then he will receive his reward. If any man's work is burned up, that means if any builder's work doesn't hold to the test of quality, that person will suffer, and he himself will be saved, even though just barely. So if we interpret this as morally corrupt, we're kind of ignoring the fact that what Paul is really talking about is building up the church versus tearing it down. But there we have it. We've thought out the implications of moral corruption. Now, what if the word destroy actually means something like ruin or harm, or destroy but not completely destroy, something like just being destructive? Well, God will destroy him, and if we take the word to mean that, then it could mean in some sense like God will punish the person who does this to the body of Christ. So that makes sense. God can punish on earth. We could probably cite other passages where God judges Christians on earth for their sin. I'm thinking of Ananias and Sapphira, for example, who are killed for introducing sin into the body of Christ. Now, in the first half of the verse, what would it mean if destroy meant like ruin? Well, I think that would make a lot of sense considering the context here, where Paul is describing Christian leaders as building up on the temple of God. Here he's threatening, if any man instead of building up is tearing down or ruining the construction of the church, or that is the temple of God, then God will ruin or punish him. So if the word destroy really means to undo, to destroy, to ruin, or deconstruct, then I think that makes perfect sense of the context. Having said that, now that we've thought out the implications of our different options, the next thing is you want to ask yourself, well, which options do I like the best? You're not necessarily deciding one, but you're kind of weighing your options and asking yourself, which of these options am I going to like the best? Well, I think considering the context of a builder building and these workers who aren't doing a good quality work will themselves suffer, even though they will not be. They themselves will suffer loss, but be saved. I think he's probably referring to some kind of deconstruction or ruining of the construction, and God will ruin them. So it is in some sense it means the same thing as suffer loss, but not total annihilation. That is, they will themselves be saved, but they will suffer loss. And I think that parallel makes a lot of sense here. That if a man ruins a temple of God or the construction, God will ruin him. He himself will be saved, but God will punish him. So I think I'm going to give that one preference. Now, to be honest though, the word destroy seems to have a pretty strong connotation. So I want to be as unbiased as possible, and our goal is always to be as honest as possible, even if it's a reading we don't typically like. And I'm going to say this could possibly mean some kind of destruction. Like maybe the person who is destroying the temple of God, God will ultimately destroy him. I don't like that idea as much for several reasons. I don't think a person can completely annihilate the temple of God, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to him. And I think it's leaving the analogy to say that. But anyway, I want to take that into consideration as I make the next step, which is going to be consulting knowledgeable resources.